Because information has a certain straightforwardness to it. And so if it's wrong, it's kind of like, why are you pushing something that's straightforwardly wrong? But it's not straightforward stuff that's being censored. It's judgment, it's interpretation, it's knowledge, it's truth or falsehood. It shouldn't be flattened down to information.
Welcome to the New Enlightenment podcast from Adam Smith's Panmure House. I'm your host, Adam Dixon. Today, I'm joined by Dan Klein. Dan is professor of economics and JIN chair at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University, where he also leads the Adam Smith program. In addition to his work as chief editor of Econ Journal Watch, he's the author of a number of books on Adam Smith and classical liberalism, such as Smithian Morals, Central Notions of Smithian Liberalism, and Knowledge and Coordination, a Liberal Interpretation. Dan joins me today to discuss hate, specifically hate speech and hate crimes. Dan, welcome to the New Enlightenment.
Great to be here, Adam.
So as I mentioned, we're going to talk about hate, which when you were at Panmure House in beginning of June, when we first met, for an amazing day discussing the relevance of classical liberalism for today and the likes of Smith. And I mentioned I had this new podcast called The New Enlightenment. The idea being is that we have interesting conversations. And you said, well, I've been thinking a lot about hate speech, and is hate worthy? And I said to you, that's a super fascinating topic, not least because in the Scottish context, there was a recent hate crimes legislation bill that came into force, very contentious. The likes of J.K. Rowling, the Harry Potter author, was involved, saying to the police, come and arrest me. So there was a lot of controversy, and I thought, I was a bit afraid to talk about the topic because I remember saying, I don't want to get canceled, Dan, not just yet. Because, even, something like this is a very sensitive topic. But as we talked about in June when we had our meeting there, at least during the Scottish Enlightenment, part of what the Enlightenment was about having difficult conversations, discussing issues that were so pressing and keeping the conversation going. And so, even though this is a difficult conversation or a difficult and sensitive topic and can raise a lot of passions and emotions, it's still worth having a conversation. So that's what we're going to do today. We're going to talk about hate speech and hate. So on that, what is hate? What's the landscape? What's going on in the world today?
There are, as you say, a rise in hate crime acts and legislation, that is to say actions by the government, and a rise in hate speech actions by the government. So there is a distinction to be made between hate speech laws and hate crime laws. I think they're both on the rise, and both being utilized in unsettling ways. What's the distinction? Hate speech laws are about criminalizing certain forms of speech, basically making certain forms of speech acts of crime, criminal acts, whereas hate crime laws are about enhanced penalties for regular crimes, like say I smash somebody's window, and it's determined that part of my motivation was some kind of racial bias or sexual bias or gender bias or something to that effect. And so there are specific enhanced penalties attaching to what are otherwise just normal acts of crime. And so those are both on the rise. And I think it's a matter of great concern. I think it's worth thinking about them. But I think it's also just great that we talk about the sentiment of hate in a more philosophical way, kind of apart from the politics, to some extent, just to domesticate the concept more, rather than let it be used as this alarmist, kind of terrifying, scared to touch kind of matter. because I think hate is very much part of any complete system of sentiments and system of virtues. And Adam Smith certainly talked about it. It fits into schemes in his system. And so, yeah, shall I go into what is hate or give another question?
That was going to be my question, right? So I think just to get things going, so we know that there's more. Just to reiterate what you said, there's more hate crime legislation that's been enacted, or at least proposed across the Western world, North America, places of Europe. In Europe, it's not new necessarily. I mean, a lot of this, at least hate crime laws, have been around for a couple of decades in some places, if not longer. Though we see an uptick at now, and then it's hate speech, which is the more recent iteration.
Yeah.
And I think we can come back to some of the implications of this. But yeah, let's just answer the question.
Let me just say first, if I may, Adam, one quick thing. There is a sense in which even 3 decades ago still makes it new.
Yes.
I mean, if we think about the longer tradition of jurisprudence and law and political theory, it is a new thing. And I do think we should keep that in mind, given that we're talking about Adam Smith and his time. But sorry to cut you off.
No. I think that's a really valid point. Again, it's that's always a struggle with any kind of sort of social analysis, is periodizing it, saying, well, you know, when did capitalism start, for that matter, right? And then you kind of write books on, well, it started then, and when was the Industrial Revolution? So, and I think that's a good thing to point out, is that 30 years ago is not that long ago in the broader sense of the kind of canon of law, at least in the Western context. So then let's get to what, at a basic level, or philosophical level for that matter, is hate.
Well, quite simply, it is a sentiment. It fits into certain categories, and it's very counterpart and symmetric to other sentiments. There is liking and disliking. Fervent liking, we often say love. Fervent disliking, hate. And this is all part of, we talk about controversial conversations. What are controversial conversations? It's when sentiments conflict, when my sentiment conflicts with your sentiment. And to some extent, that's about my feeling that certain things are like-worthy or love-worthy, while you think certain things are hate-worthy. And so it's just a very natural part of modern life, life in general. So I would say that hate is fervent disliking. I hate to be caught in the rain, and then I hate other things that, for one reason or another, I've come to hate. Mainly, I like to think, because I feel that they are detrimental to the good of the whole, good of my whole, good of myself, but I'm part of the larger whole. And so that's also detrimental to the whole. So I think it's natural and proper and necessary that certain things are regarded as hate-worthy. Let me, some things are love-worthy and we should love them, and other things are hate-worthy and we should hate them. Let me quote Edmund Burke on this. He was an Irish guy, and of course a famous English statesman, and he was a friend of Adam Smith. And he wrote, "They will never love where they ought to love, who do not hate where they ought to hate." So, if you love certain things, you should dislike things that harm those things or reduce those things that you love. And a fervent dislike is hate. And there's no reason to kind of never feel that your disliking should be fervent. I mean, there's no broad theoretical reason. Now, that said, without question, these are not symmetric. The handling and expressing of these two sides of sentiment are not symmetric. And Smith expounded on this. The two sets of sentiments here he distinguished as social passions, where the person feeling the passion has a positive feeling of like or loving towards someone else. And in this group, you could think of liking, loving, affection, gratitude, kindness, generosity, compassion. And this is a social passion, not only because like the two people easily find each other agreeable, but someone else kind of finds that the two of them are agreeable and easily enters into sympathy with both. So it's very social from the spectator's point of view. An unsocial passion, that's his term for the other set, include disliking, hate, resentment, indignation, anger, revenge, malice, envy. And here, the person feeling the sentiment is at odds with the interests of the other person who is the object of this unsocial passion. And this conflict between interests, really, between the two person, make the situation awkward for the spectator, make it therefore an unsocial passion, kind of an impolite passion to show, in a public setting. Does that make sense?
It does. I'm going to ask a somewhat postmodern question.
Sure.
And ask, is hate or these passions, are they a universal trait of the human experience? Or is this something that is socially constructed and culturally variant?
I think in their generalized form, they're absolutely universal. And if any of your promulgators of hate crime laws deny that, all I can say is I think they're either being deceptive or they lack self-understanding. These people hate too. They do. By the way, there's an old Get Smart episode. I don't know if your Scottish audience would know this old 1960s American TV comedy show with Don Adams, but he's an agent and he ends up questioning someone from an organization, and the guy says it turns out that he's a psychiatrist, and he says, "We're a hate group. We hate hate."
Right.
Right. So if there's at least one thing the anti-hate crime people hate, I suppose it's hate and haters. But they might deny that they have some fervent dislike for anything, but I find it hard to believe. Do you think they perhaps hate Putin or hate Trump or hate something else? So I think it's a universal, to answer your question. Now, of course, what object one hates, that, of course, is highly cultural.
Right. So I guess the what it comes down to is it's okay to hate, but it's what you hate is what's at issue.
I don't just think it's okay. You can't just say blankly, like just simply, it's okay to hate. Adam Smith does emphasize this asymmetry where you have to tamp down unsocial passions more than you tamp down social passions.
Right.
And there's a bunch of reasons for that I'd like to go into, actually. So there is an asymmetry and there is a responsibility with hating. I mean, it is a bad thing, but that doesn't mean you should try to eradicate all hate or stop all hate. That, to me, is a nonsensical aim.
But that often, I think, would be the response to those that are uncomfortable with hate speech or hate crimes legislation, is that they're accused of not recognizing the asymmetry, that some hate is bad and we should reduce it. They're sort of, from an operational perspective, they're saying, well, how do you define what is hate? What should be hated? And how do we manage that?
Yeah, I do think that criminalizing, if I follow you right, I think that people who are objecting to these laws have a good point where they express a concern about what is going to be tagged as hate crime, hate speech, and that can be manipulated, even weaponized.
So and this is what I think we need to come back to. But before we do so, let's talk about a bit more about Adam Smith.
Yeah.
And how he dealt with hate and this asymmetry of passions. And
Yes.
I guess the question is, all hate worthy?
Yes. Let me read a little bit of an elaboration by him about the unsocial passions. He says, with the unsocial passions, our sympathy is divided between the person who feels them, the unsocial passions, and the person who is the object of them. The interests of these two are directly opposite. What our sympathy with the person who feels them would prompt us to wish for, our fellow feeling with the other would lead us to fear. So that's the conflict. That's why, that's the division of sympathy. And that's the basis for this broad distinction between unsocial and social.
Can you translate that 18th century English into a 21st century kind of phrase so that people understand that? And I think also it's worth noting, because when people think of passions, they think of, something erotic, right, these days, right? But passions, as it was used in 18th century philosophical writings, I mean, it effectively means feelings, no? I mean, that's how we
feeling, sentiment. It has a bit more of an active connotation, whereas emotion has a bit more of a passive connotation. Not that there's a hard line there, but it's just sentiments and feelings. And what he's saying here is that when someone feels an unsocial passion, such as hatred towards someone else who is then the object of that hatred, the spectator, again, has a division of sympathy between the person feeling the passion and the object of the passion, because nobody likes being hated. With hatred comes blame. And you can quote Smith saying that, we hate to be blamed, and we hate to think of ourselves as blameworthy. And so the interests are directly at odds with unsocial passions, as Smith is pointing out. And so this is one reason to tamp them down, because somebody, first of all, somebody is more justified than the other. It's not just a love fest, a party, a love-in. There's a conflict, and so you need to enter into situations and discern better whether the hatred is justified, whether the actions that are hated by the other are justified. And so, you got to be careful. And then this conflict can create, of course, trouble and escalation. There could be damages between the two parties, or injury between the two parties. And in Smith, losses loom larger than gains. So any of these downsides of unsocial passions, whether it's just feeling blamed and being hurt by that, or whether it's some kind of escalation that leads to injury, always remember that losses loom larger than gains. And so you have to be especially careful on that side, the downside. And so for all these reasons, Smith is saying we should really check our unsocial passions and our expressing of them. I mean, it's one thing to kind of, think in your study and think about whether certain ideas or doctrines or thinkers are really bad and deserving of and even a sense of dislike. But it's another thing to go around and being intemperate in your expressing of such dislike. So he does say there's a big asymmetry. So and I think that's what the hate crime, hate speech laws are playing upon. In a sense, I feel that they're taking advantage of that truth. And then I feel actually it's kind of a politicized move. That is it's actually putting their finger on the scale in a certain way, which can then be used for certain political purposes and certain cultural agendas.
And
I don't think it's proper. Yeah.
No, unless I want to come back. Definitely want to get into that, because I think that's probably at the core of the issue. But in thinking about what Smith is saying, And these quotes are from the Theory of Moral Sentiments.
The Smith quotes are.
The Smith quotes are from TMS, or Theory of Moral Sentiments. But, you know, when he says we should tamp down, or this idea of, I mean, that's on that kind of personal level, right? At the kind of micro level, which is different from the macro level, right? I think, you know, the subtitle of Theory of Moral Sentiments is about, you know, basically how do you deal with your neighbors? How do you deal with people individually? Which is a big difference between the Wealth of Nations, which is a much more of a kind of a macro picture. But Smith is writing at a time when, you know, they were thinking about the civilized gentleman, the civilized person, right? So like that people had poise, and they thought about their own, you know, own position. How then, at a personal level, is this inculcated in individuals, right? To reflect on this. There's one thing of, you know, brilliant Smith and his fellow philosophers writing about this. How does this work out? How does he foresee this operation becoming something that individuals from, you know, the lowest classes all the way up are reflecting on these kind of interpersonal issues around hate and dislike and the consequences from that? Like, how do we move from the theory, if you like, to the kind of practice of tamping down on one's hate?
The answer, I think, goes for sort of all the cultivation of proper sentiment, not just the management of hate. And it's just the broad answer of culture, organic community, bottom up, you know, civil life. Good examples, exemplars, the whole sociology of judgment, if you will. So there's no, you know, that's the big cultural question. And we wish we could just, and, you know, I think a lot of us feel, and I certainly do, that our culture has been troubled, to put it mildly. And we'd like to figure out a way to make it better, or get so-called back on course, or pick up in some better place where we had been or something. And I don't think there's any real easy way to do that. I don't see, there's no, how do we do that? You know, it's like, you know.
So I think let's come back to that, I think, at the end of our conversation, because I think there's the broader kind of, let's say, if the liberal wants to avoid regulation, there still needs to be some kind of social regulation, if you like, that tamps down on, we don't want people to be discriminated against because of their race or their gender, or some kind of other immutable characteristic. That's, for us, that socially it's not, should not be acceptable. And if we could avoid having to codify that and police that through the state, we still need some other mechanism, whether it's through the culture, if you like, or through sort of civic education. You know, I think it's, how do we get to that? But I think, well, before we go ahead,
I was just going to add, in the sort of micro, you know, social interaction of this matter, Smith does speak and repeatedly about people not being subjected to unsocial passions, that is to say, between two other people, and that an almost immediate response is to feel dislike towards the one expressing the unsocial passion. And that often hatred, resentment, indignation arouses our dislike, not of the object of that person's hatred, but of that person. So there's, you know, this is just part of the kind of the organic nature of morals, and you might even say a certain spontaneous order of morals. So, I mean, to some extent, excessive hatred or other unsocial passions is a self-correcting problem, I think, organically in, you know, natural human groups. I'm not saying it works perfectly and it can't get carried away and all sorts of false, you know, modes of thinking, false philosophies can't sustain, wrong-headed passions. But there is some, natural correction mechanism here
within like-minded groups, though, right?
Yeah. Well, yeah, but also another thing about conflict and any kind of escalation to injury
Mm-hmm.
is that like nobody really wins, like the
No.
Hatfield and the McCoys, other than like
Mm-hmm.
liking the fight and liking the hate, which
Mm-hmm.
could be a problem in and of itself. Like it's not like they really gain anything just by
No.
like damaging the person that they feel this way about.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And
But I
so
guess
there is a certain tendency actually to resolve conflicts because of mutual damage, I would say.
right. You would hope so, but
Mm-hmm.
there's still, if you just look at the world today, I mean, military conflicts, ethnic tensions in various parts of the world, that something's not right. But though this, I think, is probably the norm, not the it's not as if what's happening now is different than any other particular period. So yes, I think conflict avoidance, but is conflict avoidance an inherent trait, or is it something else that is also
I
again
think,
a function of civilization, if you like, or
yeah, it gets into whole political issues. And are we talking about non-political groups within a stable polity where there is a political superior? And I do think that tends to go pretty well between the jural inferiors, between you and your neighbors and so on. If you have a half decent, government, other wars are wars between governments.
Yes.
And they seem to have a certain knack for sustaining those sometimes.
Yeah.
Complex interests. But anyhow,
but
I'm sorry, I think I cut you off.
No, it's fine. Let's move to then. You mentioned earlier that the increase in these, and again, we should be careful to separate out the two between hate crime and hate speech legislation. But in what's the politics behind that? And you kind of mentioned that these new laws are not necessarily about protecting particular groups, but they're about, if I remember correctly, pushing forward a particular perspective, a particular kind of view.
I do feel that they are a stratagem in that sense. And, my sentiments and opinions on this might arouse hatred among certain viewers. And so I would like to go there. But Adam, I wonder whether we should talk a little bit about, before we get there, a little bit about what like Heidi Hurd, for example, says about these types of laws. Well, she dealt with hate crime legislation in this article from 2001. I think this was before most of the hate speech stuff came in line. So let me just say
who Heidi Hurd. She's a legal scholar in the U.S.
Yes, I think she's University of Illinois,
Chicago, I believe.
No, I think she's at Urbana-Champaign.
She's at Urbana-Champaign. Okay, legal scholar that was active or still active, but writing about from a liberal perspective on, and by liberal, not the kind of American left usage of the term, but the more kind of classical liberal view. Smithian liberalism. There we go. That's the one. But let's go to Heidi Hurd's. Why should liberals care about hate speech or hate crime? We should say legislation.
Yeah, it's a very nice piece, and the title itself is very bold and striking. The title is "Why Liberals Should Hate Crime Legislation," and I find the piece quite persuasive. And I would say the first kind of point that is mainly raising out of it, there's two, is that look, there's a criminal act and then there's the criminal mind. the criminal act is called actus rea, like wrong act, versus mens mind rea, wrong mind. And that's an important distinction. You know, if I run someone down with my car, in one case it's murder, and in one case it's only manslaughter.
Mm-hmm.
If I accidentally run someone down with my car, I do not have mens rea,
Mm-hmm.
a criminal mind, whereas murder is like criminal mind. And criminal mind should and does, affect penalties and so on. Certainly. And one big point. So basically, this hate crime enhanced penalty idea is kind of like tacking on for a kind of special sort of mens rea. And one big point is like, why should this have a special penalty? Like, why not? Why should, sexism be more heavily punished than generalized misanthropy?
Mm-hmm.
Or whatever motive, whatever sentiment. Like, suppose I smashed the guy's window because he stole my girlfriend. So you could say jealousy. Like, why
Right.
should sexism be more penalized than jealousy?
Right.
And that argument just isn't made. I shouldn't really say that I know that it isn't made, but maybe it has been made and maybe it's compelling, but I don't immediately see why it would be compelling. And I don't think people think this deeply about it. But basically what it's doing by enhancing penalties for certain imputed motivations is like, in a sense, it's like discounting other motives. I mean, it's creating an inequality between
Right.
this kind of wrong mind and that kind of wrong mind. And it's just a question of like, why, right?
Right. So I think if I can interrupt, just to give an example of so people understand what you mean by that, is if you think of first degree murder, at least in the common law in the US, and I believe in Britain, it's the same, and even I think in civil law countries in Europe, that the first degree of murder is that it's premeditated, that there was an active thought, I'm going to kill this person, and likely I'm going to kill that person because of jealousy, right? Or I'm going to kill this person because of some kind of passion, which is different from a second degree murder case. And I'm not a lawyer, but as I understand it, second degree, where yes, you decided to kill that person, but it was for other split second reasons. It wasn't because of jealousy. It was, and then there's different degradations. So manslaughter, where you got in a fight with somebody and that person died, but it was, there's those different degradations. But what you're saying, at least is that first degree murder that is premeditated should be sufficient to encompass the various forms of hate that one may have in the decision to commit that particular crime. And that it would include, killing someone because that person is gay, or killing someone because that person is black, or some other kind of ethnic minority group, right? That right. Should be under the and such that the enhanced penalty is unnecessary because it's already incorporated in that first degree kind of murder classification.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Like, it's kind of like almost giving a special privilege to doing this kind of penalizing. And that's right. I think you put it well. Let me mention her second major point, and that's that that racism, sexism, and so on, the things which are associated with hate laws, she feels are generally more like character traits and general dispositions a person has, rather than a momentary or specific situational thing like a jealousy over some specific incident.
Right.
And so, because if someone's a racist, it's not like, oh, they were just racist the day they broke the guy's window, right? And she said the idea that the law should be out to punish certain character traits is like very, very dangerous and troublesome and very, very anti-liberal. Because we are going to differ in our character. First of all, it's not clear how much you can choose your character traits. I mean, some people might be jealous or envious or misanthropic by nature, and you may not be something they can very well correct. Whereas, suppressing moments of jealousy and feelings of anger in the moment is something which you can learn to control. That's what Smith called self-command. And so this whole distinction between like a situational impulse or sentiment versus a general a broader character trait, she makes that a big point. And she says it's very unliberal to use the law to, try to socially engineer, punish, and reward different kinds of character traits. Liberal society is about us cultivating through a bottom-up organic way different points of view, different worldviews, different associated character traits and sets of virtues that go with them. And that's kind of like what the whole liberal idea or proposition is about. And then, of course, there's just the fear, which gets us to this final topic of how this kind of use of law and politics could be abused. And she very much ends her thing on her piece on this warning. She says, let me read just the last sentence and then I'll stop. The last sentence is, the burden remains on those who would operate on people's personalities with the state's most powerful instrument to assure us that they will excise only what is diseased. So in other words, she's worried about using this kind of power against character traits to punish political opponents, to weaponize and, basically privilege a certain cultural or political point of view.
Well, how, just to play devil's advocate, so she was writing in the early 2000s, and she does mention this, I think, in the paper, about the Matthew Shepard case. And I remember this, because I grew up in the Denver metro area in Colorado, and Matthew Shepard in Wyoming, which is just not very far, an hour a bit north of Denver, hour and a half. A young gay man who was effectively tortured and left to die on a fence post, and was left in a coma, and severely beaten and tortured. And it was, and I remember because I was in high school at the time, just finishing and thinking, wow, it was terrible, and it made national news and international news. But that spurred a lot of kind of concern about, what we as a country, as a society, should do to tamp down on this kind of, those types of people, right? So in the sense that, how do you separate out the murder where the guy kills the other man because he's jealous that he stole his girlfriend, versus two people that basically took Matthew Shepard and then tortured him and tied him up to a fence post in the middle of Laramie, outside of the outskirts of Laramie, Wyoming, for him to die, right? I mean, that's that level of kind of just thinking about it, it makes you sick. And it's really one of those cases where you think, yeah, but do we need more, right? So like enhanced punishment almost seems like we need a first degree murder plus, right? And I guess, I'm taking Hurd's argument, but then you look at those cases and we think maybe we need more. What's the argument then against that?
Look, like stalking and imprisoning someone and then torturing him or her, like I have all the same revulsion and I hope all the same, weight of the law, but I don't particularly see why, like Jeffrey Dahmer or someone who abducts, I'm a father of a daughter, and I'm always had this horrible nightmare about my daughter being abducted while she's out running or something and being imprisoned and tortured and whatever.
Yeah.
And I don't know. It's let's just
Yeah.
crush these people. And
Yeah.
the other thing about saying, well, look, it's one thing to be Jeffrey Dahmer, but if you're anti-gay, then you're really a bad person. One thing that leads to is like having to determine that it wasn't like a generalized misanthropy, just like a
Mm-hmm.
kind of sadism, whatever,
Right.
however you want it, whatever words you want to start
Sure.
bringing up. But then you have to get into like this whole, well, what was going through the guy's mind? Was he merely a
Yeah.
misanthrope and a sadist, or was he actually also an
Mm-hmm.
anti-gay person?
Mm-hmm.
And here Smith says that when motives and sentiments themselves become criminal, he says every court of, this is a quote from TMS, every court of judicature would become a real inquisition. And just like, the Spanish Inquisition, you get, forced confessions, and you get,
Yeah.
it doesn't work out very well.
No.
So, there's other ways to decry and denounce and socially ostracize particular problems like that. I mean, it is a sicko
Yeah.
thing, obviously. And people are maybe accustomed to hearing that you shouldn't generally treat like fellow creatures of God in a bad way. And then even the ones that like have different worldviews or sexual
Right.
practices or colors or whatever,
Mm-hmm.
like it does need more work always. But
I guess
it's just I still my presumption is still against making this special thing,
because it's too difficult from a legal perspective to get inside the mind of somebody and adjudicate those character traits and to
partly because of
adjudicate
that.
those motivations. And
Yeah.
I think she also brings up an example of a man who, I think it was, if I remember correctly, who was in a bar fight. There was some kind of assault over, I don't know. It wasn't that the fight over the bar was kind of just a normal bar fight. Then it turns out later that they found that he, had a tattoo that he got years ago that was, I think, some kind of a white supremacist tattoo or some kind of indicating that he maybe had racial bias or prejudice. And then that was used in the same, oh, that must have been a hate crime, even though that tattoo might have been from a past kind of, life, and that actually this particular assault had nothing to do, or this interaction had nothing to do with racial animus. But because he had this tattoo, they were able to say, oh, that means you did it premeditatedly against these people because of race. And that was where she said that's kind of a very difficult thing that shows that you can easily abuse the system or punish someone for their thoughts, if you like, their past thoughts even.
Yeah, there's all those dangers. And, to get into this question of what it's all about, the proliferation of laws and such. I feel that it is something of a stratagem to silence certain forms of I don't mean like bigoted speech or something, but just stuff that then gets deemed or associated gratuitously often with racism or bigotry or prejudice of some kind, redneckism, Trumpism, what are the other words? MAGA nation and what have you. Populism, of course, populist, anti-immigrant, racist, right?
Right.
And so it all gets kind of wrapped up, and there is this danger of using this kind of stuff to criminalize political opposition, political dissent. And you might say, oh, you're overstating things. They're not putting people in prison for this. I do believe that it can intimidate people. The process is the punishment. They don't have to actually end up in locking the guy in jail or fining him or debanking him. It's just the intimidation, the quelling, the process, the being questioned, the police showing up at your door, being questioned about your media content. I mean, believe me, I'm an academic in the U.S. I see people like this. I can't say that I've myself been a target of this, but I know many people who have, who just whatever, they say anything, whatever, and it gets dressed up and thrown around or just lied about as in these terms. And then there are petitions and witch hunts and so on. So it's kind of, and the courts and the procedures can be very kangaroo-ish. And so they might be counting on kangaroo courts to kind of let this go through or to actually punish the person. So I'm just saying this is a matter of real concern, to put it mildly, and it's part of a broad kind of censorship, I would say, agenda, just like the disinformation nonsense I see as a censorship stratagem.
Well, let's talk about that, right? So
Sure.
let's move from hate crimes to hate speech. And you've kind of mentioned this, and it's, I'm glad you mentioned academia, because I do see a certain level of self-censorship happening on the part of academics. And it's not simply exclusive to those that might have, let's say, conservative views or notionally conservative views. I think there's even those on the left that are afraid of speaking out their views, or for fear of a right-wing mob, if you like, attacking them. So it's not necessarily that it's partisan. I think there's a lot of bipartisan censorship and intimidation happening, unfortunately. But what does this say about, in terms of hate speech laws, and that general stratagem, as you say? What explains that? I mean, where is it coming from? And what does it mean? What does it say about liberalism today?
Liberalism in the Smithian sense, if I may just say the classical liberal sense, I just think is extremely hurting today. And it's really ripe for, I think, kind of a comeback. And I hope an appealingness with people at large. And Scotland certainly ought to be ripe ground for it, given the heritage. It's in very bad shape today. And I think especially in our political leaders, I think political structures, government, parties are in very bad shape. Frankly, I feel that the vicious tail is wagging the parties. The vicious tail of, like every kind of group of people, association has a distribution of virtue and vice, if you will, and maybe like a normal distribution. And then at the lower end is the more vice as opposed to the higher virtue. And then sometimes things happen in such a way where the people with lower virtue somehow, wag the party, wag the group. And I actually feel that that's happening to some extent. I do think governments have been weaponizing more, abusing power more, tyrannizing more, lying more. And then to avoid accountability and to sustain the big lies, what do? They find they have to double down. So it's kind of a downward descent situation. I feel that we're in a phase of that in terms of civilizational crisis, where a lot of the elites in government, I'm not against the elites in all things. I really like Novak Djokovic and Roger Federer, elite tennis players. But political, governmental elites and others who are affiliated or influential to them, I do think there's kind of a vicious downwardness going on. And all this is reflective of that, I feel.
It's interesting to see. So in Central and Eastern Europe, places like Hungary, Poland, though it's changing slightly, but take Orban's Hungary, and he's implemented quite a few what are in effect illiberal policies, constraining the media, outlawing different
NGOs,
foreign NGOs, in a way that's constraining of speech, right? It's very illiberal. But then if you go to Western Europe, go to Scotland, you go to Ireland, you go to North America for that matter, and you see concerns around misinformation, bad speech, and then almost explicit efforts to not quell it through illiberal means that like Orban has done, right? So he's kind of quelled speech, institutionally by outlawing organizations or, banning particular kind of media organizations or kicking out the Central Europe University, the CEU, to quell speech. He's doing it in a very explicit, but then it seems in the more developed liberal democracies, they're not necessarily doing it through codification, though that is happening. They're doing it through intimidation, by having speech censors, having kind of the sense of, well, and people are afraid to speak up.
Yeah. And they're intimidating the platforms,
mm-hmm.
and plus just aligning themselves with them.
Mm-hmm.
There's huge operations by the government now to get the Facebook and Google and so on to do their bidding that way. There was just a court decision yesterday, which unfortunately didn't go against censorship. The dissent is very good. The six threw it out on standing, which seems utterly preposterous to me, because it's like, if they don't have standing, who does? Like, who does have standing for free speech violations? Like, I don't get it. But anyway, I think that censorship is very much a Western agenda as well. And it's happening. And this malinformation nonsense is another stratagem, in my view. And I've actually written on that about how inapt it is to dub all of these interpretive and judgment content claims as information. That's a big part of the trick there. They're dubbing it as information so that if someone's like spreading misinformation, because information has a certain straightforwardness to it. And so if it's wrong, it's kind of like, why are you pushing something that's straightforwardly wrong? But it's not straightforward stuff that's being censored. It's judgment, it's interpretation, it's knowledge, it's truth or falsehood. It shouldn't be flattened down to information.
And how, I'm curious, what role do universities have to play in this? And what's happened at universities that has exacerbated this? Or is it and again, I think there's no centralized force that's leading it, but where do universities fit in this broader kind of censorship?
They're part of the broad constellation, the censorship industrial complex. Is that what Michael Schellenberger calls it? And some of them are like the Stanford outfit and what have you. So there's, but universities are. I am at a university, so there's universities got people different points of view to some extent still.
But there isn't that. The concern I have with a lot of universities is that, or the university culture in general, is that I don't feel that there's enough debate.
I agree.
And there's not an embrace of viewpoint diversity. And again, that's not kind of, like I think there needs to be, well, how do I want to put it? Because I have to be careful saying this, because then some people think, oh, you must be one of those kind of conservative voices that's keeping his mouth shut. It's not at all, right, how I think. But again, I don't recoil when someone has a view that is conservative or as a viewpoint that is different. I think, actually, okay, let's hear it. But unfortunately, it seems that there's been a lot of discouragement of having a different perspective or questioning things. And I think it's and I just say this, because you have these conversations in the pub after the conference because people are saying, oh yeah, this is what's really going on, and it's terrible. But everybody's afraid because they're afraid of students revolting, they're afraid of their careers being destroyed, even people with tenure.
I'd say that, Adam, to you personally, that as the Adam Smith, fellow chair, Panmure House, it's really part of your responsibility to have conservatism part of the conversation, because Smith was a liberal, but he was a conservative liberal. He believed, it was kind of like within some kind of functional, stable polity, he favors allowing every man to pursue his own interest his own way, by and large. That's the liberal part. But when it comes to like the forms of the polity and the procedures, the institutions, he's really rather conservative. And he is a kind of conservative liberal. I think that the pitting of conservative against liberal was, in a way, another stratagem.
Right. Yeah.
And so that side of him, which is like Hume and like Burke, is like super important.
No, and I think for me, but there's also something to add, and it's the tolerance for difference, or tolerance for
there's that
diversity
too, of course,
of thought,
right?
And for me, I always think of and what I say to people, at least with the ambition at Panmure House and the ambition even with this podcast, is that my view is that I'm happy to talk to anybody, right? I want to, one week I'll have Dan Klein on to talk about Smithian liberalism. The following week, maybe I'll get somebody that's a card-carrying Marxist that has a very different viewpoint. And I think for me that is, but I think people are afraid to do that. Because it's, again, people are afraid just to platform somebody and have a conversation with them in a way that I think, no, we should be having these debates. We should be having diversity. And what I've noticed, just to add, when you look at different podcasts, and I know there's a gazillion podcasts and what out there, but more often than not, I find that there are, let's say, the more conservative podcasts, and their guests are all the same, and they do the rounds, right? So they all go on the kind of same podcast tour. And then there's the sort of more left-leaning podcasts or left-wing ones, and it's all the same kind of characters that come together, and they all kind of do this thing, but there's not enough of this going on. And I think partly is, just to kind of think about my development of this podcast and Panmure House generally, is that there's a risk of being put in either of those camps, and just by platforming one person, right? So if I have Dan Klein on, someone is think, oh, well, Dan Klein, he's one of these libertarians out at Mercatus and George Mason, and you think, that's what we need to go against, right? Because I think is that sense of, why are we afraid to have different types of voices speak? Because to me, that is what is so fundamental to a liberal and open society, right? I mean, I want to hear from the critical Marxist, because, you think, oh, they're bringing out something that I'm not really thought about, and maybe we should. I might not agree with the solution per se, but it makes us think about things that we maybe haven't. And, so it's like, I've got time for postmodernists even that want to deconstruct everything and think about how we use language. It's like, yes, let's have a conversation about that. But even that is not possible, it seems, anymore.
I totally agree. And there's a number of topics which we wish we could have a nice big public debate on, whether it's vaccine safety or whether it's the Project Ukraine, and the two sides just don't come together.
Yeah. No, and I think it's unhealthy for democracy. It's unhealthy for society, and I think it's unhealthy for our communities, and it makes life less enjoyable than it needs to be. Let's say, and it feels a sense of authoritarianism, which But I guess I'm going to give you the last word. What is it that we need to do to advance liberalism in the classical sense. And by that, I mean a society, a polity that allows for people to flourish, to be who they are, to express themselves in a way where they don't have to fear for their own safety, and that they feel that even others that might not appreciate them, they're safe from, violence, if you like.
Well, I don't know how to improve people's safety or make them feel safer. And I don't want to do anything to tamp down courage. But just in a kind of general philosophical response to what we could do more of, or think is Adam Smith, and in particular, I've been doing another thing about his self-command stuff and pride and vanity as troublesome passions, and it kind of comes back to a relational sense of existence, which is to say, relating to another being, even if it's kind of a spiritual, imaginary kind of theistic being, quasi-theistic being. So this idea of kind of that spiritual, relational understanding of things as opposed to a mechanistic. This is a theme that you'll hear from other, people with big followings. Not that I have a big following, but from other people, many of whom have big followings. I'm thinking of like a Jordan Peterson and many of his guests and others. This kind of relational notion of ethics and morals and virtue, just like much more of a focus on virtue. I think we should work more on virtue.
Work more on virtue. On that note, I think it's nice to end on that, particularly given the name of the podcast, The New Enlightenment. So Dan, thanks so much for being on. Hopefully this won't be the last time, and hopefully I'll see you at Panmure House again in the future for some more conversations and dialogue.
So Tim, thanks a lot.
You have been listening to the New Enlightenment podcast from Adam Smith's Panmure House. If you found this interesting, please consider subscribing and sharing. If you would like to learn more about Panmure House, please go to our website, panmurehouse.org. Thanks for listening, and until next time.